Yeah, so those that don't know me, my name is Iain Taylor and I'm the research manager up at SPHSU on the 4th floor, so that's the Social and Public Health Sciences unit. I used to work in the charity sector, and then I moved over to sort of working in the research sector, and I've had some experience as like a grants officer, a project coordinator, and things like that. So, I'll talk about it a little bit, but I feel like at the moment in my job, I have a foot in sort of both camps. I have a foot in sort of the researchers camp, making sure that researchers can sort of get the funding they need for their projects. But I'm also, I sort of have to make sure we all follow the university processes and cost things correctly. So, yeah, I think what we're going to cover today is what is full economic costing, or F.E.C, why it's important. So I wanted to cover why it's important for funding applications, and also why it's important for navigating the university approval processes. And then most importantly, why it's actually important for potential projects, and that those things are all kind of linked together. And then just also spend a bit of time specifically on how the University of Glasgow's approval processes for costings work. And I think for probably a couple of years, I thought that this sort of thing might be useful as a research skills seminar. I think a basic understanding of what full economic costs are and why they're important would be useful for researchers when sort of considering funding applications. So that's what hopefully we'll cover, and I think it would work. It's not the most exciting subject. I'll do my best to try and make it interesting, but it will work best, I think, if people ask questions as we go along. That would be helpful. Okay, so a bit of background about why I'm doing this talk. Does anyone know where this is? Yes, Kew Gardens, yeah. So we've got the beautiful gardens, Millennium Seed Bank, herbarium. So I got a job at Kew in 2013. I used to work in the charity sector, helping with funding applications to charities and foundations. And suddenly I had a job at Kew helping the plant scientists get research funding from NERC and EBSRC, and I hadn't really come across full economic cost F.E.C before. I didn't know what indirect costs, estates costs were, but suddenly I found myself as being the only kind of funding person there, desperately trying to get my head around it. So that's, I had to sort of do quite a lot of research into it to try and understand it. And I'm going to present some of that to you guys today, which hopefully might give a basic understanding of what it's all about. A bit of background. In 1998, there was this thing called the Transparent Approach to Costing that was set up, which is known as TRAC. And this was a methodology developed between funders and the higher education sector to help them calculate the full economic cost of their activities. So obviously there's quite a lot going on around 1998. I don't know if it means, you know, there was a new Labour government and they were trying to look at why the research infrastructure across the UK was so run down. And the conclusion they had was that it hadn't been properly resourced, hadn't been properly funded, the full cost of it hadn't been funded. And also tuition fees were coming in around this time or being proposed. So there was a much greater appetite for more transparency around how universities costed stuff. So that's a bit of the background there. I think this little quote from the KPMG review sort of sums it up nicely. So the emerging appetite for understanding the cost of research and use of public funds. So this isn't, so indirect costs and full economic costing isn't something that the University of Glasgow has just come up with, or a group of universities thought it would be a great idea to try and get a bit more money. It was something that was set up between funders and the sector way back in 1998 to 2000. And the F.E.C, the full economic cost, obviously applies to funding applications. I think most of us have probably seen, when we look at a call for proposals, something might say, oh, so-and-so will fund on the basis of 80% of the full economic cost of your research. And that's to make sure that the funders and the universities are sticking to this approach, this transparent approach to costing. Okay, so when I was struggling with this, someone helpfully kind of ran me through an example using a Mars bar. Right? So I'm going to show you what I think is the full economic cost of a Mars bar, and hopefully this might be a kind of useful way of thinking about research. So I think basically, from what I can see, these are the costs involved in producing a Mars bar. But the ingredients, manufacturing and packaging, marketing and advertising, distribution and transportation, and then the retail markup, which might include taxes. So does anyone want to have a guess at what percentage of cost of a Mars bar is the ingredients? And I have a prize for this, and you won't guess what the prize is. Anyone want to put out, Mary Kate?
5%.
Any advances on 5%? 10.
8.
How many, sorry? 8.
1.5.
1.5. It's actually, it's a bit more, it's 27%. So David, you win the prize. I'll leave this here for you. Okay, so roughly speaking, from what I can see, 20.6 pence of the 75p Mars bar is the ingredients. The ingredients, manufacturing and packaging is actually less than half the cost of a Mars bar. So the rest is, distribution, marketing, retail, tax. So I found this a useful way when I was trying to get my head around it all, thinking about what the full economic cost of something was. It's not necessarily the things you see or would expect. There are other kind of built-in costs that make up a product or something. So the full economic cost of research is basically made up of these areas. So salaries, travel and subsistence costs, equipment, maybe capital equipment, consumables and other costs, and then this mysterious one here, indirects and estates costs. But broadly speaking, that is in the same way we saw for the Mars bar, the different categories. These are the categories that make up the economic cost of research, the full cost. So the indirects and estates, what are these? Well, the indirect costs are things like, this is my understanding, general office costs, things like stationery, furniture, library services, subscriptions, finance and departmental services. So all the brilliant professional services staff we have in school would largely be funded from money that filters down from indirect costs. Computing costs as well would be another example. And then the estates costs are things like the building and premises costs, utilities, and things like insurance as well. So indirects and estates are the two main categories of indirect costs within the full economic costing model that universities and funders use. Any questions about that? Does that broadly make sense? So it's sort of stating the obvious a bit, but indirects and estates can be charged to UKRI and NIHR grants and some others as well. And this is because these funders were involved in agreeing to and setting up the whole sort of methodology around full economic costing in the past. A key thing is that the University of Glasgow has its own set rates for calculating indirect and estates costs, and this is per the TRACK methodology, that transparent research costing approach. It might be of interest to know that so the school has its own estates costs, which are different from other parts of the college. So because we don't have any wet labs, our estates costs are a little bit lower than, say, cardiovascular school. So I can't remember the name of that school now, but, or the one that was 3 Eyes before. But in terms of the rates, we don't, as researchers, we don't really have to worry about them because the university has a system that just calculates them all automatically. And then a really key thing to remember is that when it comes to funding applications, it is the research costs that generate the indirect and estates costs on costings. So that is what that is how you would end up with indirect costs and estates costs on a funding application costing. I'll come back to this in a minute. And the grade of a researcher has no impact on the rates of indirect costs and estates used. So a senior professor, the indirect costs for a year of a senior professor's time are exactly the same as the indirect costs of a year of a grade 6 researcher, for example. So it is the cost of a person doing research in a particular location in the university. Doesn't matter how senior they are.
Can I ask a question? At the point there you mentioned the university's costing system.
Yeah.
Is that like a piece of software? Or?
Yes. Yeah. So I think I'll come on. There's a little bit on this later, but we have the university uses an Aggresso accounting package, and there is a module the university bought for Aggresso that is a research costing module. So that has all the latest salary data in it, and it has all the latest information around indirect costs and estates costs. So if one of our project coordinators puts in 20% of so-and-so for a 3-year project, clicks a button, it all just comes up with the cost and the right rates. It's really important under the methodology that there is a robust system for this. I don't know how closely people look at their award letters, but there are penalties for the university not following agreed track methodology for its indirect rates and quite serious sanctions. So that's why the university has invested in it quite a lot with this system. Yeah.
I think you've got a question. Go ahead.
You said research staff costs, but does that also apply to any professional services staff that get costed in?
No.
Just research.
So that's an important point to note, that it is only the research staff that generate this. So, any administrators or project managers, they do not generate indirect costs on a costing, and that has implications for the approval process, which we'll see in a bit. Yeah, Hilary?
Is that calculated on the projected cost of the researcher or the actual cost of the researcher? I'm just thinking one of our projects was supposed to have a research associate who was never actually recruited, so there's been no cost, but we are getting docked quite substantial indirect and estates.
Yeah. So it's on the budget will always be an estimated budget for your project.
Yeah.
And the way the university does it is it just automatically starts when the award is set up on the system and live. Even if you haven't recruited a researcher yet, the university will automatically just take the indirect costs and estates costs. It does it on a monthly, breaks it down by month. And it's allowed to do that because it's part of what's known as these directly allocated costs, these estimated costs.
Yeah.
I think if you didn't recruit that researcher at all,
Which we're not going to do now.
then they might, a future auditor might look at that and say, oh, hang on, that's not right. We'll have that money back.
So can we reclaim that?
So you can't use it for anything else, unfortunately. It depends on the funder. Usually you would not be able to sort of use that money on something else. But I would talk to your project coordinator about it. See, I used to be a project coordinator, but that was a few years ago, so I'm a bit rusty on this sort of thing. But I'd sort of mention it and see.
We never managed to recruit the individual projects nearly finished now. So.
Who's the funder?
Forces and Loan Trust.
So you might be able to have like just a honest conversation with them about what's happened and see and make a plan.
We have a good relationship.
But your project coordinator would definitely be the person to talk it through with and come up with a plan. Okay. Any other questions?
Annie asked my question.
Okay.
I suppose to follow up on it, if you're like me and you're officially a researcher, but you're doing some support role in the project, who does that fall?
So if you're officially on a research contract, then you fall into this category of generating indirect costs, and it's like a shorthand way of the F.E.C calculation. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, other times it will, but it's just a short way of kind of coming up with adding indirect costs to a costing. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not comparing Mars bars to researchers, but we're going to do something similar with the researcher. So we're going to look at the full economic cost of a grade 7 researcher. So the salary of a grade 7 RA is about £40,000 for at the moment if they're in the middle of the grade. Then university's pension contribution on average for someone at this grade that's part of the USS scheme would be about £8,800. The university as an employer has to cover national insurance contributions. So for a year for someone at that salary, it's about £4,000. Then there's this funny little apprenticeship levy, I think it was brought in about 5 years ago by the government to try and raise money for apprenticeships. Then the indirect costs for a year of a researcher would, under the track methodology for the University of Glasgow, would be £58,000. The estate's costs on top of that was about just under £7,000. And then there's this other funny little category of indirect costs called technician infrastructure, and I don't really know what that is still, but I think it's to do with the technicians needed for lab support and office support. Another £2,000. So the total cost, so if any of you are going to come for a costing for 1 year of a grade 7 researcher, the economic cost of the university would be £121,000 for that year. So I think that's quite a bit more than you think. When you think intuitively about how much the cost of a researcher is, you tend to think of like the salary, but actually there's a lot of other costs. And yeah, so that's, the green bit is the salary. Even just like what you might think, you're thinking about the direct cost of the salary and the university pension contributions, the NI and stuff, it's still less than half the cost of, still less than half of the full cost. And it just sort of to re-emphasize the point about the cost being the same regardless of the grade. So if this was a professor, the blue stuff's all the same. Obviously, the salary would be more, and that proportion is different. And kind of if it was a grade 6 researcher, then it's the proportion of the salary cost is even less. Yeah. Did you have a question, Russ?
Yeah, I'm just getting around it a little bit, but I'm just thinking, so that's the cost that a funder would supply to the university for that grade 7 for a year, so the university's getting
Yeah.
profit out of that compared or not.
Yeah.
So it's
So
that's
it,
the
well,
from the funder to the university.
it's what the funder. So it's what the funder wants to. The funder wants to know the full economic cost, and the university wants to calculate that. But the funder may only provide 80% if it's, for example, if it's the MRC. The university, we'll come on to this with the approvals, the university gives projects 100% of the direct costs. It doesn't say to the PI, oh, actually, this scheme's only 80% funded, so you can't spend £20,000 on that event, you've got to spend whatever 80% of that is. So I think it's the F.E.C approach. It's like the funders want the whole cost, and then they decide how much of that they're going to provide. And then for the university and the approval system, there's a bit of a trade-off between, okay, well, we're getting these indirect costs, so that kind of covers that shortfall if they're only giving us 80%. But I was going to come on to that. Yeah, Johnny?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, do you know how they ended up, the funders saying, right, we're going to pay 80%, not 100%?
That's a good question.
The overvaluing the full economic cost?
I don't know. I think it's possible that they want the institutions to make a contribution themselves. Some funders have a different rate. So the UK PRP scheme, Prevention Research Partnership Scheme that funds CIPHER, that's 67% of the FEC is funded. And that's because that scheme is made up of different funders like the Wellcome Trust and who don't fund indirect costs, and MRC which do, and you end up with a bit of a fudge. So in some situations, the funders will decide what co-financing rate to provide. I don't know why 80% is the one that's so common. I would suspect it's to do with wanting the institutions themselves to accept that they're not going to get the full cost, and there needs to be some sort of contribution.
The indirect costs are really shocking.
Yeah.
As a proportion.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
And I know that you covered on in the other slide that you were, but can you remind me? Because I'm really shocked by that.
Yeah. They've gone up a lot in the last 6 months. They really have. So they are things like general sort of office costs, office consumables, subscription, library services, the cost of support staff in departments as well. So I think with cost of living allowances for everyone, it's probably pushed up the indirect costs a little bit, as well as general costs of everything else going up. Yeah. David, and then?
Just mentioned that there's some variation between different schools.
Yeah.
For instance, is there also variation across different universities?
Yes, yeah. So there'll be different, I think the university, I think they sort of do some analysis, they come up with what they think is appropriate rates. I think that's then audited by someone and then sort of signed off. So yeah, different universities have different costs. Different schools have different costs. You know, ones that are running a particle accelerator might have higher mission and infrastructure costs, higher estates costs in the School of Health and Wellbeing. But they are all, the process of estimating those costs and then getting them audited is quite formal.
Is that all publicly available? Is there a table of
I don't know. It's probably on the university's website somewhere. But then good luck finding that on the class.
That was my question as well.
Okay, so I think like just on the FEC, the key things to remember as researchers is it tries to capture the full cost of research, and it is accepted by funders and the whole sector. So it's not just a University of Glasgow thing. It's not just something that's someone in finance is just sort of, let's just charge £58,000 for every researcher. There is a sort of formal audited methodology around it. And then finally, the salary is just part of the cost of a researcher. So often when I've been involved in doing costings, people see how much it costs for a researcher and can't believe it. And they say, well, I don't get £120,000 a year. So yeah, that was sort of one of the key things I wanted to sort of get across. So I was going to move on a little bit more about the kind of costings approval process and why some of this stuff's relevant to that. Are there any other questions before then?
If you just quickly check online, make sure there's no questions that come
Okay.
in. You can see the chat.
I can't see any, but I can't quite see the whole. Is anyone who's online got any questions? Can you maybe turn your camera off and wave? Are there any questions? Okay. I think that's no. Okay. Annie, did you have another question?
So if you've got a grant where you're working with multiple partners across many universities, you need to get this right early on with their research support departments, just to get their costs if they're different.
Yes, yeah, and most universities have their own costing systems or similar, the same costing system, produce the information in the right format that we need, except Kew Gardens that will have to be calculated on a spreadsheet. Okay, so yeah. So university, some of you I know we're very familiar with this process. So we'll talk a little bit about the university approval system. So a key thing is that the funding application approvers consider the FEC of a proposed project. They're not just looking at how much you're going to get from the award. So if an award for £100,000 only covers, and the FEC of the project is actually £500,000, then that's going to have some difficulties getting approved. So the funding application approval process is based around the FEC of the project, and it uses this Aggresso system. You might hear people talk about ARCP, Aggresso Research and Costing something or other, or the research system. It's the same thing. It's this kind of electronic approval system that works through Aggresso. Usually a typical workflow, which is what it was to be called, is that the PI approves the costing, it goes to the head of school and then goes to the director of finance in the college. A key thing is that the project, if they're awarded, the projects get 100% of the direct costs, regardless of the funding rate. So typically, funders offer 80% of the cost effect. Projects which get 100% of the direct costs. And then the finance colleagues will consider something known as the research contribution when they do their approvals. This is really boring, but I think it's really important. And it's a terrible name for what is basically a figure in a calculation. So I don't know if anyone's seen these sorts of things. They used to be called PAFs. They're now these project approval summary reports. So this is the sort of document that gets looked at by approvers in the university system. It's got three tabs, and it's incredibly difficult to read. But the key thing here is this contribution percentage, research contribution percentage. It's got nothing to do with how important the project is and what kind of contribution it's making to society. It's just the term that is used by finance colleagues. And what this tries to do is look at how, I've got it written down. So basically, it's a metric to use to establish how profitable or costly a potential award is. And the lower the contribution, the more costly it is, the more approval it needs. So in this example of you're getting a £100,000 award, but the actual full cost is £500,000 because they've said we're not going to fund any investigators and we're only going to fund 50% of the total cost anyway. It would go up, it would sort of go up the food chain in approvals. It would go up, the Director of Finance would approve, then it would go to the head of college, maybe, then it might end up going up to Anton Muscatelli. It was going to, on paper, cost the university £400,000. It would need a higher level of approval. And this automatic system we have will automatically look at these figures, and it will look at what funder it is, and it will decide who then needs to approve in what situation. This particular example, 20% research contribution is very healthy, and that's effectively the surplus being generated by the award on top of what the cost is. If it's minus 20, it would be costing the university money to host the award. Any?
It needs to be a question, but when you say that the project gets 100% of the costs, how does that work out? Because it's not really the project, is it, if it goes to estates or indirect?
Yeah, so it gets 100% of the direct costs. So the estates, the indirects, they just happen in the background, but the project gets 100% of its consumables, its travel, its direct costs, salary costs, researcher costs, investigator costs. But it is the indirects that enable that to happen, because they plug the gap. The indirects plug the gap. So on a typical funding scheme, only funds 80%. The college is looking at a 20% gap because it's going to give all them 100% to the project and the team. It's looking at that 20% gap, and it is the indirect costs that help plug that gap. So the way the finance people look at it is through this research contribution figure to make a decision on whether or not they want to approve. So a couple of other little things that might be useful to know. I think some of you will know this, but there are different thresholds for UK public funders versus charities. So charities won't provide any indirect costs normally, and they also won't tend to fund investigator costs, people that already have a salary at an institution. However, they give 100% of all the other costs. So, but in where we are, in MVLS, they will allow a contribution of up down to minus 12%, even though it costed, on the surface, it looks like it's costing money. Those approvals will still go through because it knows it's getting money surpluses from other grants, from other funders. And the surpluses from research contributions flow back to the schools and the college as well. So in a given year, the more surplus generated by research grants does find its way back into the school health and wellbeing's general funds account. That's why Jill's interested in the contribution as well when she signs off at the head of school level on funding applications. Yeah.
I'm just trying to get my head around what these numbers mean. For example, we're talking about the UKRI, which will generally fund 80% of the indirect costs. So if there was a straightforward grant application for a researcher to do a project and they were going to get 80%, what would that research contribution percentage be?
It depends
roughly?
It depends so much on the amount of on the salary levels. So our really expensive people, the research contribution tends to be bad because the indirect costs, pie chart, the indirect cost is a lower proportion of the overall cost. If you've got a lot of non-pay costs on a grant, which aren't, say you've got £500,000 non-pay costs on a grant, they're only being funded at 80%, and those costs are not generating any indirect costs. So that's tipping the balance in the other direction. So it is complicated, and perhaps that's why that sort of spreadsheet, that approval summary form is complicated. There's a few rules of thumb that I was going to come on to about those. So generally, for UKRI and NIHR awards, the more researcher time equals the more indirects, which equals easier approvals. The other way around, the less researcher time, the less indirects, and it tends to get harder to get the approvals. And by harder, I mean it might just go up the food chain and you find yourself having to write a case for Ian McInnes about why this should be going ahead. And on the other side, the higher proportion of non-pay and admin staff costs, researcher costs. So remember that admin staff don't generate indirect costs. The approvals get harder. And again, that's just because that balance of the indirect costs are becoming a smaller proportion of the overall award. You probably don't need to worry about this, but sometimes if you're having problems with an application getting signed off, it might be that some of this stuff is kind of coming to play. And then for the charity funders, a very different sort of model, but something to be aware of. The more investigator time you have, that means you have more unfunded costs, which are then harder to get approved. Something I used to see, particularly pretty much have the same project going to UKRI and Cancer Research UK, and the PI time would be 5% on one of them for the Cancer Research UK one and 20% on the UKRI one. And it's usually because of this pressure around the funding of it. And yeah, just again, I don't know if this makes sense, but the higher proportion of researcher and non-pay costs, investigator costs, leads to easier approvals. And that's because research assistant costs and non-pay costs are 100% funded, and the investigator costs are not funded. So, I hope none of you have to get into this detail.
Yeah, presumably with charity funders, if you've got honorary staff acting as investigators, that helps your case.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Because they don't go salary.
Yeah, yeah. Something to exploit. So last slide, and thanks for bearing with me. So key things to remember, and this is like a really key thing. I get asked a lot about this sort of thing, but the projects get 100% for the cost they need. The college will give, if you are successful with an award, you don't have to worry about whatever the financing rate of that fund is. You get 100% of the direct costs that you need to do the project. But it is the indirect costs and the F.E.C approach that enables the university to do this. If they weren't getting indirect costs and there wasn't a system for this, they wouldn't be able to give us all the direct costs we need to complete projects. Research contribution has nothing to do with how important a project is. It's just the term they use for this particular metric to look at how costly or profitable an award will be. And proposals with negative research contributions can still get approved. And if they didn't, we wouldn't have any charity funding, really. And finally, I hope this has sort of been useful to think about some of the stuff that's going on around indirect costs and full economic costing, but you should always cost an application on what you need to deliver the project. There might be some pushback around, do you need that much investigator time on this grant, or you should, we increase the researcher time to make it more likely to get signed off, but you should always go with what you need, and those conversations can kind of follow. Any other questions? Does anyone have questions from who's online?
Ian, I've got a silly question.
Yeah.
Have you had many projects getting rejected at university level?
No, I haven't actually. What usually happens is there's a bit of negotiation. So we don't sort of submit funding proposals unless it's strategically important anyway, and in most cases it's manageable. And the university, we're lucky. Our university has sort of such a broad portfolio of projects and funding that it can kind of balance things out. If some project is potentially a bit more costly than another one, it can manage that. Johnny?
It's really interesting, thanks, Ian. I was just wondering, because it seems like a lot of these numbers are like you could game quite a bit on both ends. So thinking about, as a researcher applying to funding, you want to look like value for money. So ideally you'd want these costs to be as low as possible to the funder, or to look at it, especially those indirect costs. You wouldn't be thinking about as much as the university would be. Whereas they're on the other end, I guess, trying to inflate those as much as they possibly can. Actually, so there's that kind of thing going on, as well as none of it seems that transparent. Like, is there an actual breakdown of how they're getting to these final things? Because it seems like you could play around with how many staff you have, even, and that you'd be dividing by a lower number or a higher number, or you could build a new building that costs a bit more, and then your costs go up and stuff.
Yeah. So
is there like a really clear outline of all this stuff somewhere, or is it all kind of behind?
Yeah, so I haven't seen it. So you're right, there is that tension between what the researcher wants and what the college wants. I think the purpose of the track and that methodology is that, it's been agreed with a representative body for the funders, and it's sort of signed off, and then it's in our system and we don't have to worry about it. So I don't know how the details of how that is calculated. I think sometimes they go down. So a couple of years ago, the indirect rates actually went down. So I don't know if that's reassuring. They went down, and then they've jumped back up again because of inflation the last 6 months. I mean, I'm fairly confident. I'm confident there's a proper process for it. They are based on, as good estimates as possible. David?
Did you get a sense that funders and researchers are generally happy with the current system? Are there any changes on the horizon?
I don't know. I think there's been a bit of a push for reducing bureaucracy around research costings from the government. So I don't know if that might have an impact on the process for these kind of rates and things. At the moment, I haven't seen any changes there. I think the approach is it's just generally accepted by the funders and institutions, and everyone's got a expensive software package based on it. So I think it's going to stay for a while.
Do the big European funders also use F.E.C?
So the European Commission, when I was working on funding applications, they have like an indirect rate, like 20%, for example, on framework program grants. So it'd be like a fixed rate. Okay, thanks a lot. It's not the most. Any questions? Drop me an email or talk to your project coordinator.
Will the slides be made available?
Yeah. It's my Kew Gardens.
So at the start, this is part of the research skills and development seminar series. So if anyone's got any suggestions for other topics for general school skill development, just let us know. Enjoy my Mars bar. Thanks.
No, I didn't know how to use the chat. I was worried about because I couldn't get it set up.
There's no person to help with this setting up.
Oh yeah, no, George did it.